All right, let's continue our discussion of Book 1, Chapter 7 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We are on page 11 of the crisp Cambridge translation. We're at margin number 1097b6 for other translations. Aristotle has just finished arguing that the chief good is going to be something that is complete, that is going to be fully satisfactory, and something that is not chosen for the sake of anything else. In other words, the chief good is not going to be an instrumental good. And he's argued that this is what we call happiness. Happiness is a thing that we choose for itself only, and never for the sake of any further good we plan to get by being happy. At the top of page 11, he continues, "The same conclusion seems to follow from considering self-sufficiency, since the complete good is thought to be self-sufficient. We are applying the term self-sufficient not to a person on his own, living a solitary life, but to a person living alongside his parents, children, wife, and friends and fellow citizens generally, since a human being is by nature a social being. We must, however, set some limit on these, since if we stretch things so far as to include ancestors and descendants and friends of friends, we shall end up with an infinite series. But we must think about this later. For now, we take what is self-sufficient to be that which, on its own, makes life worthy of choice and lacking in nothing." Okay, I'll pause in the text now for some commentary. Aristotle is turning now to the claim that the chief good, the highest and ultimate good for human beings, will be something self-sufficient, and he's grasping for a preliminary definition of self-sufficiency. And he notes in passing that we don't think about self-sufficiency as applying to the individual entirely on his own, but the individual in the social context of living a life with parents, children, wife, etc. But this can't include the entire human race, obviously, so we will need to do some further limiting later on. For now, though, he says, our preliminary definition is that a self-sufficient good is one that makes life worth living entirely on its own, that if we have it, our life is worthwhile. If we do not have it, presumably then we are lacking what we need in order to be living a fully excellent and flourishing life. And this, he says, is happiness. The text resumes, "We think happiness to be such, and indeed the thing most of all worth choosing, not counted as just one thing among others. Counted as just one thing among others, it would clearly be more worthy of choice, with even the least good added to it, for the good added would cause an increase in goodness, and the greater good is always more worthy of choice. Happiness, then, is obviously something complete and self-sufficient, in that it is the end of what is done." So Aristotle here is noting that this self-sufficient good we've been talking about is in fact happiness. Happiness is this thing that we regard as making life worth living. In this regard, happiness is not just one good among others that we might choose to pursue if that happens to be our thing. Instead, happiness has this character of being a good that is added into and goes beyond other goods. In other words, I don't play the flute or work in my garden solely for the sake, instead of being happy. I do these things because I achieve happiness through them. So happiness is not one item on a menu of goods that we might happen to choose. It seems to be that thing that we choose through every other good that we pursue. The text goes on to the next paragraph. "But perhaps saying that happiness is the chief good sounds rather platitudinous, that is, it sounds like a cliché, and one might want its nature to be specified still more clearly. It is possible that we might achieve that if we grasp the characteristic activity of a human being. For just as the good, the doing well, of a flute player, a sculptor, or any practitioner of a skill, or generally whatever has some characteristic activity or action, is thought to lie in its characteristic activity, so the same would seem to be true of a human being if indeed he has a characteristic activity. That's the end of that paragraph. Aristotle here is turning towards the function of a human being. He's saying we may think it seems too simple to say that happiness is the chief good of human beings and we all pursue happiness. We want a more specific definition of what happiness is, and then most especially how we can become happy, how we can pursue happiness in our daily activities. And he says we can do this if we think about what the characteristic activity or the function of a human being is. Now this is going to be the activity that human beings only can do, that no one else can do, that characterizes us and no one else, or the activity that we do best among all the beings that act. So we're going to be looking for some activity that is uniquely human and that stands at the peak of human performance, the kind of thing that we do that seems to be the ultimate expression of our nature. And he gives some examples here, and more in the next paragraph, of function arguments that we're already familiar with. A flute player, the good, the excellence of a flute player comes in his playing of the flute well. The excellence, the good of a sculptor or a doctor comes through the doctor and the sculptor being able to perform their characteristic activity to the highest standard in an excellent way. So if human beings generally, or human beings as such, have some characteristic activity or function, then it's in the perfection of that function that we're going to find the happiness or the chief good or the final excellence of human existence. So the following paragraph, the last paragraph of this page, begins this way. Well, do the carpenter and the tanner have characteristic activities and actions, and a human being none? Has nature left him without a characteristic activity to perform? Or, as there seem to be characteristic activities of the eye, the hand, the foot, and generally of each part of the body, should one assume that a human being has some characteristic activity over and above all these? What sort of thing might it be then? I'll pause in the text now and note that Aristotle's argument here is that human beings as such have a characteristic activity or a function, and his argument here through a series of rhetorical questions is to cite the evidence that one, specific types of human being, a tanner, a carpenter, a flute player, a doctor, a sculptor, each of these types of human being has a characteristic activity or function, and also that the individual parts of a human being, the eye, the hand, the foot, we might also say the liver, the stomach, the spleen, each of these has a characteristic activity or function which it does well. It is healthy and proper when it does its job well, and it is malfunctioning and not contributing to the good of the whole person when it does its job poorly. We are familiar with standards for judging a good sculptor from a bad sculptor, a good doctor from a bad doctor, in terms of their performing their function well or poorly. And we're also familiar with judging a good and bad eye by its ability to perform its function, to see well or to see badly, a good or bad hand, a good or bad foot. So his suggestion here is that both of these pieces of evidence point towards the conclusion that human beings have some characteristic function. And now it's our job to ask what it is. Resuming the text. What sort of thing might it be then? For living is obviously shared even by plants, while what we are looking for is something special to a human being. We should therefore rule out the life of nourishment and growth. Next would be some sort of sentient life, but this again is clearly shared by the horse, the ox, indeed by every animal. So, the commentary. The first two types of thing that Aristotle is rejecting are what we will see later on as the lower functions of the human soul, the functions of nourishment and growth. These cannot be the characteristic human activity, merely being alive, because they're not unique to humans. We share them with plants. So doing that well, simply being well nourished and growing properly, is not going to be the characteristic activity of the human being. Neither will sentient life, or the life of using the senses, of moving around and interacting with your environment, be the unique human activity we're looking for because it's also shared with animals, with horses and oxen. Back to the text. What remains is a life concerned in some way with action of the element that possesses reason. And here I'll comment, what Aristotle is giving us here is his moving towards a preliminary definition of happiness. What is the characteristic human activity? What is the function of a human being? It is the action of the part of the soul that possesses reason. It's some kind of rational activity. Okay. This is not too specific yet, but we're zeroing in on the area where we're going to find this ultimate function of human beings, and it's in performing this rational activity function well that human happiness and excellence will consist. So this paragraph concludes. Parenthetical remark. Of this element, one part has reason in being obedient to reason, and the other in possessing it and engaging in thought. As this kind of life can be spoken of in two ways, let us assume that we are talking about the life concerned with action in the sense of activity, because this seems to be the more proper use of the phrase. Okay. My comment, I don't think these last two sentences add anything that is really important for us right now for this text, so I think I'm going to conclude just by reiterating that Aristotle's function argument has come to the point right now of asserting that the characteristic activity of a human being is the activity of the part of the soul that is governed by reason, and that it's in further specifying what this activity is, how it's related to action, and how it's governed by reason. This is where the definition of happiness and the search for the chief or ultimate good of human beings is going to go next. That's all for right now. Goodbye.